Now for the finishing touches, we're going to add some post-processing filters. We're going to add two of them, one for HDR and one for focal blur, or depth of field. To do that, first let's load in the scripts. So let's change the right window to the text editor. Go to the text menu, click on Open, go to the scripts folder, and let's load in all four of the scripts in there. Let's see if we can do it four at once. And we cannot. So looks like we've got to load them in one by one. So bring in the DOF depth blur script. HDR. We have read luminance, we just need one more. Read depth. So now we have both those four scripts loaded in. We need to apply them to the scene. To do that, let's change the left side buttons to Logic Editor. And that's not a good place for that to be. So I'm going to change that back to Properties. I'm going to split this window horizontally. And I'm going to change the bottom to the Logic Editor. This kind of layout demands a horizontal menu for it, or a horizontal field for it. So just find one object in your scene that you can use to attach all of these scripts to. It can actually be any object. I usually choose the camera. I'm going to set the camera up for a good view anyway. Alright, so with the camera selected, and our logic buttons at the bottom here, simply add a sensor of type always, then add a controller type and let's connect those two together. And on the right, add an actuator called filter 2D. Change the filter type to custom filter, and in the script field, let's start off by loading in depth blur and connect them. Add another actuator called filter 2D of the same type, custom filter, and load in the script HDR there. And connect that end controller to that filter as well. Now we need to change one of these pass numbers because this is the number in which filter is rendered. They can't both be the same pass number, so I'm going to change the HDR pass number to 1 and keep the depth blur pass number at 0. Now we can minimize those two, and let's add another sensor called always. This time we're going to enable true pulse, which is this little left icon there. That means this sensor is always going to fire. It's always going to run whatever we have connected to it. So look, now add a controller called Python script and change this script type to read depth. That way, wherever the camera is, it's always going to read the depth of whatever it's staring at in the center, and it's going to use that to apply the focal blur. Then before we add a property, there's one more controller we need to add for luminance. So add a new Python script controller, connect the true pulse always sensor to it, and load in the read luminance script. So now all of our logic bricks are set. We just need a couple of properties now. Call the first one focus, leave that as a float, and another one, let's call that average, capital L, so AVG, capital L, and add a third one called capital HDR, and then lowercase amount. So that third property again is HDR amount. Leave them all as floats, and that should do it. Let me explain the logic bricks real quick. The first always sensor loads in the 2D filters into the scene so that they're always rendered. And then the second sensor continuously runs scripts read depth and read luminance. Read luminance is used for the HDR script. It finds the, I don't know how to describe it, but the color values of the scene, and it judges how much HDR amount to add to the scene. So if you're in darker areas, the HDR is going to look different than if you're in brighter areas and things like that. And the read depth script I've already described as being used for the depth blur script. And let's press P and see how it looks. You can see the colors have changed because HDR has been applied and focal blur has been applied as well. Things in the foreground are much more blurry than those in the background because that's where the focus is set. And just to illustrate that, I'm going to move the camera kind of closer to the ground, sort of pointing at the ground. So everything should be blurry except this puddle here. So let's press P and see how that looks. When things come into focus, the puddle is nice and sharp, and everything around it is blurry. And that's how that works. Now I'm going to create a new image at 512 by 512 for our lens flare texture for our flare effects. I'm going to use a large round soft brush and paint a black dot on the middle of a white canvas. I'm going to invert those colors because we want our flare texture to be white. Then I'm going to adjust the levels, making it a little less intense. Then I'm going to save that as flare.png. The reason I initially painted black on white is because it made it just a little bit easier to tell where the edge of that dot was, so that I can make sure it didn't extend outside the bounds of the image and that it was centered properly. And now we're going to create something called a halo object. Now halo, when applied to a plane, basically makes it track the camera view on all axes, making it appear to have volume. But we have to orient this in a very certain way in order to make sure that that happens correctly. So I add a plane from top view, and now we're going to unwrap that and apply the flare texture to it. And then we're going to orient the mesh so that it's rotated properly to work with halo. So after you load the flare texture onto the plane, from front view, rotate the vertices in edit mode 90 degrees counterclockwise. This has to be oriented in a very specific way for halo to work. So if I enable the axis here, you can see how the axis is pointed and how the object is pointed relative to the axis. We have the z-axis pointing up, the x-axis pointing to the right, and the mesh object, the face actually of the mesh, is pointing on the negative z-axis. Now change the Blender options to Blender Game options if you haven't done so already, and in the texture face panel with that face selected, disable collision and enable halo, and change the transparency type to add. And now I'm just going to center this flare object in the center of the light bulb, and then we're going to add a material for it. So remember to create this plane object from the top view, and in edit mode rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise in front view, and then halo will work properly. So I just added a material for it, I named it flare, and I enabled shadeless since we don't want this to be affected by lights. I'm going to create a texture for it, and it's going to be a simple texture. We're just going to load in the flare image, the texture, and we're going to change mapping coordinates to UV. And that's all we have to do for this. Now when you enter game mode, in camera view or in perspective view, this plane is going to orient itself so that it's facing you directly. No matter where you move and no matter how you're looking at it, it's going to make sure that it's always facing you. And that's how halo works. Billboard is a similar thing, only it tracks you on one axis. So it's more useful for things like trees in the ground, whereas a halo object is really good for lens flares. So you can see how it just reoriented itself to face the camera. Now here I was just playing with the intensity values of the lens flare texture, see if it looked better or worse. But when you're using something like an HDR filter, you don't want this to be too bright, else it's really going to blow out when that filter is applied. So I end up going back to the original intensity values that I had for it, which although looked a little gray, blended together really well in real time with the HDR filter applied. Now one last thing I'm going to do is add that to the light group so that every instance that's in the warehouse right now is going to have that lens flare with it now once we open the warehouse again. So I just reopened the warehouse. You can see that all of the lens flares are on the lamps now, except there's a little bit of a square outline to them. We're going to fix that by enabling exclude mist next time we go into the lights blend. But you can see how that lens flare really blends nicely with the light bulb and the background, especially with the HDR filter. I'm going to open up lights blend again, and we're going to fix that square issue, which we do by simply going into the material settings and enabling exclude mist and the options panel. And that fixes that. There's one more thing we have to address before we're completely finished. If you remember, we made one of the light instances a local object and an editable object in the warehouse so that we could edit the wire and make sure that it met with the other hanging wire. Because that's no longer a group instance linked from an external blend file, it's not going to have that lens flare object applied to it. So we're going to have to create a new instance and edit it again. So there's that hanging lamp right there that we edited earlier. It does not have a lens flare. So I'm just going to select the group instance across from it. I'm going to duplicate it, move it over in its place. Then I'm going to delete the old hanging lamp that has no lens flare. And in the same way that we edited that hanging lamp with no lens flare, we're going to edit this one now. I'm going to press Ctrl and A and make that a real object. But to make it editable, we have to duplicate these two objects and then delete the originals. You can just duplicate the lamp if you want to, but I duplicate both of them. So I just moved it up out of the way so that I can delete the originals behind it. Now I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to edit the wire like we did before, so that it meets with the hanging wire. And that's that. We are completely finished our warehouse environment.